Hi there, welcome to our Performance Edge Weekly Wisdom, where speed drive performance. Coach Soul here. Today we are going to discuss about feeling overwhelmed. Specifically, how do you handle being overwhelmed? First, professionally, how do you cut through overwhelm and how do you optimize your productivity despite being overwhelmed? Second, on a personal level, how do you leverage being overwhelmed as a stepping stone to create more stability and more order in your life? And by the end of this video, today, not only will you understand how and why overwhelm occurs, but also I will share with you the best practical common strategies for transforming overwhelm into decisiveness and optimization for productivity. So, and best of all, by the end of this video exclusively, I will share with you the anatomy of overwhelmed from a total new understanding and in a new lens that was understood since ancient Egypt and how it has been used since the dawn of time by the masters as a generative power to create stronger order and stability. Ready? Let's jump in. So in today's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, as they say, the VUCA world, it's easy to feel overwhelmed because there are too many demands in our lives, especially that the challenges are multi-leveled and more complex. Here in this video, we will explore the many facets of overwhelmed. So after watching today's video, you will learn how to tame being overwhelmed. Not only professionally, I will share with you the best techniques from a top expert on defeating overwhelm, but also most importantly, in today's video, you will understand the anatomy of overwhelm and why it is a signpost for more order that is needed and stability in your life. So I will introduce you to a totally new understanding of overwhelm from an applied spirit lens, which will help you transform any type of overwhelm you will encounter moving forward, whether it's at work or in your personal relationship. And lastly, by the end of this video, if you stick till the end, I will teach you an effective insight that you can use during the most acute overwhelm you might be facing that will be helping you calibrate so you can overcome any overwhelm might they occur. Ready? Let's get started. So let's level set about overwhelmed. Because overwhelm happens when you perceive that there is too much to process and to handle. So according to an article from Harvard Business Review, How to Deal with Constantly Feeling Overwhelmed, it's clear that the mental impact of feeling constantly overwhelmed can range from mental fogginess or mental sluggishness to imprecision, to confusion, to difficulty concentrating or thinking logically, or that constant feeling overwhelmed even lead to a reduced ability to problem solve. So which is important because cognitive fatigue occurs when there is too much demand on people all the time at all times, which leads to less mental agility and prone people to distractions, which without a doubt leads people to be less effective in being overwhelmed. Now, there are a lot of strategies, and the current methodology, according to the expert, there are many tactics on how to deal with overwhelmed. But if we dig deeper, one way or the other, I'm going to share with you, all revolve around 5 major strategies I will share in a minute. So for context, in their book, Immunity to Change, Harvard professors Robert Keegan and Lisa Lehay, they discuss how the increase in complexity of the world leads to being overwhelmed and how it has really nothing to do with how smart we are, but rather how we make sense of the world and how we operate in it. So unfortunately, most people's typical response to ever-growing workload is to work harder and to put in long hours, rather than to step back and examine what makes us do this and find a new way of operating. So that's really what they summarize in the book. And so according to the article here, we're looking at 5 strategies that kind of really have best strategies and best practices. One of the first strategies when you feel constant overwhelmed is pinpoint the primary source of overwhelm. Ask yourself a question: what are 1 or 2 things, if it's taken off my plate, will alleviate 80% of the stress that I feel right now? Because this question will help you identify a significant source of your stress. The second strategy that's suggested is to set boundaries on your time and on your workload. Meaning create block time for yourself, learning to say no, and all these tactics you can use under that strategy of setting boundaries on your time and workload. The third strategy is challenge your perfectionism. And here it's getting a little bit into your psyche, because perfectionism can lead you to make tasks or projects bigger than they need to be, and which can lead to procrastination and psychological distress. In a way, know when good is good enough by asking yourself, what is the marginal benefit of spending more time on this task of this project? And if the answer is very little, stop where you are and be done with it, right? And that leads us to a fourth strategy. It's outsource or delegate. So basically asking yourself, what is the best use of your time? If activities that don't fall within it, just delegate. The fifth strategy is challenge your assumptions. I like that one because I'll even develop more on it. It's a little open door, but we don't emphasize much here. Because if feeling overwhelmed is basically an ongoing struggle, it's likely that you have assumptions that are keeping you stuck in like unproductive behaviors. Like, for example, you might be asking yourself, well, if I lose control, others will mess up and the company might fail, right? So you might want to examine some of the limiting beliefs that are not likely 100% true and kept you stuck in old patterns that significantly contribute to your sense of overwhelmed. So by identifying and debunking these beliefs over time, they're able to kind of help you broaden your perspective. And I want to make sure that you get that. So those are basically 5 strategies that are suggested in the article. And regardless of the tactics that are offered out in the marketplace, you will see that from the research, all of them will fall under these 5, under this umbrella. So now, besides this top strategy suggested from the expert, from the experience and the feel myself, being, in high tech, in Silicon Valley for 22 decades, there are principles that are really important here that you can use, and I want to share those with you. The first one is a Pareto principle, right? In industrial engineering, how optimization is important. But the Pareto principle we've all heard about. It's basically 20% of action produced 80% of the result. The 20-80 rule you might have heard. And they talk about that a little bit here. And that Pareto principle is really a good way to really practice. It's the best practice that helps you alleviate overwhelmed or help in your productivity, because it's really a statistic and it's really a fact. Now, the third major strategy that's a best practice that's out there that I've seen, it's a little bit, I'll say it's a branch of the Pareto principle. It's a book that came out a while ago. It's called The One Thing. And I don't have any affiliation with the writer, but it's really a good practice I want to share with you here if you haven't heard. It's by Gary Keller, the founder of Keller Williams. But the one thing is basically leveraging that Pareto principle and asking yourself, and it's basically, the idea is there's one major central questions. And the argument is that if you focus on doing the right thing, the one thing, and that matter most, and you ignore everything else, you will be able to achieve extraordinary result. So in fact, the book says the one thing. So that's the main question, because the question is, what is the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else will be easier or necessary? I'm going to repeat that question. So what's the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else will be easier and necessary, right? So it's really looking at the Pareto principle, because the question is, what is the one thing I can do? So if you kind of look at it, break it down into 3 parts, the one thing you can do is you may choose a vital one, right? Thinking out of many, right? So besides being specific, you must choose, your choice must be actionable, right? Something you can do versus something that you might do, right? So in that way, that focus your impact on action, right? And the second part of a sentence is such that by doing it, and this part of a question indicates that there is a criteria, right? Your answer must meet. So you're doing something for a specific purpose, right? And when you do that one thing, something else will happen, right? And the next part of a sentence is such that everything else will be easier and necessary. So in a way, your one action will be a leverage for further action toward accomplishing your goal, right? And because after completing your action, the subsequent steps will be easier, and some may not be even necessary, right? So which tells you that many things don't need to be done. If you avoid distraction and start by doing the right thing, your one thing will be the first domino. So again, the question is, what is the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else will be easier and necessary? So if you look at that in summary, the focusing question is both a big picture and a small focus, because your one thing is your big picture goal, and your one thing right now is your priority today for getting there. So this is another way that really, if you can leverage the Pareto principle, it allows you to kind of really boil down and leverage that. It's a great best practice I've seen. I want to share, make sure that you use it in case you are faced with that kind of dilemma. The next bigger best practice I've seen out there, it's understanding the concept of urgent and important. And this is really relevant, and that's really important here. What do I mean by that, urgent versus important? Overwhelm happens because everything seems to be relevant and important, and at the same time, everything seems urgent. Would you agree? So what do you do when everything is urgent and when everything is important at the same time? You feel spread thin. That's basically the definition of being overwhelmed here in many ways. So the best strategies I have seen out there is the 4 quadrant of Stephen Covey. I remember almost over two decades ago I learned this. But Stephen Covey has a 4 quadrant, and you can see it here. And if you don't have time, I suggest you go and Google that. I won't spend too much time on this. But in the 7 habits for highly effective people, Stephen Covey kind of shared that 4 quadrant. But if you look at it, it's basically a matrix looking at what's urgent on one axis and what's important on the other axis. And that's how you get the 4 quadrant. The first quadrant is basically urgent and important, and this is where you need to manage. And the second quadrant is not urgent and not important. This is really where you want to focus if you're a manager. And then the third quadrant is the one to avoid, is basically what's not important and what's urgent, right? Those are basically the interruptions, busy work. And the fourth quadrant you want to limit is basically not urgent and not important, right? Those are basically the busy work, emails, the trivial work, and all that. So those are the 4 quadrants. So in those 4 quadrants, you can manage and really being able to get out of overwhelmed. And the overwhelm will happen into, for the most part, into urgent and not important. You'll be there. So, but if you can look at everything you have to do and divide it, you will be able to really get a lot of overwhelm out of your plate. And this is basically you being able to discern what's important and what's urgent. And that will help you to leverage that. So this is really, in a nutshell, what are the best practices, high level. Quickly summarize, is a 5 strategy from the Harvard Business Review that I shared, which come from a book, Immunity to Change. That's really good. That's the first if you want to do something right away, you can jump in there practically. The second thing is the Pareto principle. The third thing, the question is, what's the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else will be easier or necessary? The fourth strategy I share is understanding and discerning what's urgent versus what's important. Because when we're overwhelmed, everything seems urgent and important. And there, in dealing with that, the 4 quadrant from Stephen Covey, which came from his book. So with those benchmarks, the question is, what are the current results and what do we see in the market? The reality is, even with all these best practices, there are always challenges. And the major 5 mistakes we see out there is because of overwhelmed. People, usually have 5 major mistakes. And that happen is, the first one is you think you don't have time for action that will help you. Right? The second mistake is you are stuck only in your conscious thinking and you are missing out on a holistic brain power. Because what you forget here in this case is focus isn't the only way to get things done. But yet the overwhelm is really using only that part of the brain. And the number 3 that really mistake that happen as the overwhelm is not handled is you interpret feeling overwhelmed as a weakness. Right? That's your interpretation you have about being overwhelmed as a weakness, which is really not the case. And the fourth thing is people default into their dominant approaches and their defenses and their weaknesses, right? And the last big mistake that happened is that people withdraw from support, right? And because they're overwhelmed. And because at that time when you're overwhelmed, you probably have limited emotional energy, which can lead to important changes in your behavior and emotional availability. So those are the current results, looking at the approach that are out there in the market, that we see on the market there. So the question you ask yourself is, so this is great, but why it's not working? What are the limitations of the current methodology? And this is where I really am going to share, the applied spirit perspective, which will help you really take not only the practical best practice out there, but will allow you to really have a long-term solution. Because most solutions provided from the expert, they're helping cope with the overwhelmed. That's the reality. But for the most part, as you can attest, all these solutions are temporary solutions that do not resolve the long-term problem. And it's because of the first paradigm I'm going to share right now. So the first paradigm is this. It's a paradigm that overwhelm is an external factor. What do I mean by that? It's basically the oversight and the responsibilities that you are overwhelmed because there's too much demand on you, which is half truth. Because in this paradigm, you are decoupling yourself from the events that cause your overwhelmed. So instead of looking at it from a holistic viewpoint, right? So a good technological analogy, from my engineering training, I want to share here, could be a microprocessor, right? Microprocessor that goes in a computer, right? A microprocessor that is not faster enough to process the many that are coming at it at one time. So in that new picture, there are 2 approaches. Either it is to reduce the amount of data so that the microprocessor can process the data flow, or the other approach and answer is to get the faster microprocessor so that the processor can process the data flow faster. So, but I don't know about you, there is a quote that had an impact on me when I was in college, my first year. And that says this: don't wish it was easier, rather wish that you are better, right? Don't wish that it was easier, rather wish that you are better. It's Jim Rohn. Meaning, improving yourself is something within your control versus wishing that society or the data coming at you were too much or to handle, right? And here's the reality. When you are better, you can always regulate what makes sense to you, right? So the paradigm need to change when it comes to handling overwhelmed. The paradigm you need to get is to understand that it's not isolated problem. You need to look at it as a systemic unity problem, systemized unified problem. In a way, the data input, which is a stressor, and the processor capacity, which is our ability to handle the overwhelmed, are one. What do I mean by that? Because the first key, as we will see further, is to realize that the holistic systemic paradigm I'm suggesting is what will provide the sustainable answer. And that paradigm is really the first thing to understand and really change your perspective. The second pillar that's important that you need to do instead to have a long-term solution is the new paradigm, the new understanding that happen. Human experience, that your experience is driven by 3 drivers. And the solution lies in understanding a new paradigm that was understood since ancient Egypt. But before we dive into this, I want to just emphasize why the understanding of this paradigm is important. It's simply because of this. Because of the excessive volume of data we need to process every day. Our brain does 3 things. It either delete, distort, or generalize. So in a way, it creates a filter, right? That filter makes us prone to illusions, whether it's good illusions or bad illusions. Regardless, that is the basis of being in denial. That's where emotionally people get in denial because of that happening. And so emotionally, you're either in denial, or you're avoiding, or you're escaping, or you're trying to bury your true emotions, right? So the paradigm I'm going to describe is very important to understand. And I don't have a whole time going here, but you can find out more about that by watching my video about the quantum door. And basically the quantum door is a spirit elevation platform system that equips people to move from being rigid, from being stuck, from being self-absorbed, from being doubtful, from being frustrated, overwhelmed, to being effectively in the flow, confident ease state of optimal performance, right? So in that understanding, right, the 3 drivers that the quantum door teaches are basically social conformity. The second one is self-projection. The third one are resources. So social conformity, you want to think of it as a pressure and as unseen, right, or the unspoken rule that are imposed on people by accepted society norms. So as you can imagine, nowadays, with social media and the 24-hour news cycle, that is always there, right? Conformity is elevated to critical levels. Drivers, self-projection, just basically reflect the doubt, the insecurities, the fears that are inherited through your personality, through your weaknesses, right? And the third driver is resources, which are important, especially when there is a feeling of scarcity. That's important. Will I have enough money? Will I have enough time? Will I have enough energy to survive or to satisfy my needs, to satisfy my wants? So these 3 drivers are at the basis of the formation of your illusions and your filters, right? Particularly when the brain delete, when the brain distort, and when the brain generalize, because there are too much information to process. So with that new understanding, that leads us to the most fundamental that the quantum door teaches. That was at the foundation of ancient Egypt. And it's this first paradigm. This third paradigm I'm going to share. And please pay attention here because it's paradigm. What is that third paradigm? Is this. Your reality is spirit into form. Your reality is spirit into form. Because looking at the quantum field, everything out there is energy. Meaning all form of all things that exist are then just a different manifestation of energy. Or you could say they are different form of energy, right? So when you think about it, the animating energy that carries within the breath and the power of life is one and only one thing, your spirit. Meaning your experience is a result and the form of your desires. The visible is a form of invisible. Meaning, let's look at it specifically here in the case of overwhelm. Why that matters to you here? Because now let's put it into practice. Because what appears as an overwhelm is in fact a misalignment from your authentic spirit desires to versus your reality you're experiencing. So the overwhelm you experience is a reflection of a gap between your authentic desires versus the reality you're experiencing. And here is the good news. It's a wake up call. You need to handle it now. The bad news is, if you don't, it will keep elevating and turn into a louder crisis. It's going to be burnout, depression, and many more. So overwhelmed, basically reflecting that there are illusions on your way of your authentic desire expressing that exactly they need to be in alignment, right? So which leads us to our next part. So what do you do instead? So let's wrap up all the learning that we have talked about. So what do you do instead? And this is where you have applied spirit at work. And the first part is to understand why tension occurs, right? So why in this case overwhelm occurs? And if they need to understand tension, and I shared that in a couple of my videos, but it's worth repeating, because tension is basically the illusions from the drivers versus authentic desire, right? Because you are not able to see your true reflection because of your illusions that are on your way. Like a dusty mirror, illusions, they interfere for you to see your true reflection. And that causes misalignment and pain as a result. And spirit reflection are designed to identify the driving elemental trait which was seeking expression. And in nature, in the cosmic order, feminine energy and the feminine polarity is what started and ignite motion in this plane. Just look at electrons, for example, meaning an elemental spiritual trait seeking expression is always manifested via the absence, or a negative trait in this case. As an example, to experience courage, you will need to face your fears. In order to experience speed, you need to know what is slowness. You need reference. So the goal of reflection is to discern which negative trait was at play and what it was seeking to experience, what was that initial desire. So to find that out, one must go through identifying the pain, then discerning a fear, which will lead you to identify the illusion and why you did what you did by looking at the data. So as you see the illusion at work, then you are able to reconstruct using attention and see what was your desire. And that's a process of evolution. Don't have too much time here, but that's how you become a co-creator, right? So why are you overwhelmed if you understand now that process? It's because there is an expectation, because there is an image, there is a value of who you think you are, that you're holding, who you are supposed to do, who you are supposed to be by when, what you're supposed to do by when. So that image, that values need to be outgrown. So most importantly, it means to be rebuilt within. So the spirit work is to uncover that consciousness level and to evolve from that, right? And you review that illusion through the three drivers we talk about. And then that's when you can evaluate, should you change your expectation? And you can know that by looking at how authentic the goal and the expectation you had was. If it was authentic, it's a delay, it's okay, right? So you need to be cognizant of that. So then right there, that's where the next stage, after moving from why you're overwhelmed, is to identify what needs to be outgrown. Yes? So what needs to be outgrown? So you need to write down all you have to do, the to-do list, right? And here in the to-do list, just to be clear, you need to normalize the time component. What do I mean? Meaning that you are able to discern what we talked about, what is urgent versus what is important, what is due now, right, etc., right? So if you humor me, for example, let's say first you're adding, let's take the kids to the park on the to-do list. Let's take the kids to the gym. I need to do my boss project. I need to have my coworker trained. I need to call my sister. I need to send the CFO a report, right? So let's say that's a list. Now, the second part is to identify all the major assumptions from who you have to be. What do I mean by that? Use an objective or an attribute or how you perceive yourself that basically will be the hidden assumption. In a way, for example, in order to have a CFO report or to finish the boss project, the adjective would be what? I need to be a reliable boss, or I need to be a trustworthy coworker, right? So reliable, trustworthy are the adjective, are the attribute you need to give yourself. So if you can see that now from a label that you see in a category of your list, are you able to see now that maybe the threshold you have set, like maybe says all the email need to go through you, right? That basically reflecting how you micromanager. Yes? Hope you can see that. Because nothing can be done to perfection if I don't control it, for example. That can be another assumption you made. So what that leads you to, should you learn to trust more? Or is it insecurity? So is it a control issue? Is it a trust issue? So when you see from the list the attribute you are adding you can see the illusion driving your behavior. Can you see that? I hope you can see it. So then you can decide to change your threshold, right? Maybe you need to learn to delegate, maybe you need to create more block time, etc., etc. In that, you are handling the issue of overwhelm at its core. Hope you can see it. But now, I don't want to be too long, but since you stuck around, I want to give you a bonus tip, and which is to track the nature of your overwhelmed. And here is really the bonus trick, because overwhelm comes into two forms. The first form is a depth issue or a functional issue. The second form is a width issue or a structural issue, right? It's a width issue. So if it's a depth issue, meaning there are so many details you feel like you cannot really handle it, it's overwhelming. What that means is you might need some additional training, or you might need to change the scope of your role, of your job, and redefine the expectation, right? Which means if you need to go deeper in depth in the details, right? But if it's a width issue, structural, quantitative, meaning it's quantitative, you need to look to be grounded and identify where you are stifling yourself, right? And I know there is so much I want to add about this, but I want to make sure that it's not too much. So I really want to make sure that you get that. And again, I really want to talk more, but if you want to know more, and there is more we can talk about, but I really want to give you the nuts and bolts of this. But if you want to know more and continue this conversation with me, please sign up to our brand new community, Free Souls, right? Free Souls, and you will get access to more tips and relevant answers to your real problems. Again, Free Souls, and you'll get access to more tips and relevant answers to your real and unique problem. The link is in my comment below. And also, if you have any issue you want me to talk about specifically, you can submit those in a comment below, or you can request specific video topics also by logging onto www.thequantumdoor.com/videos. And those is really where you can see it, right? And I really want to just, before I leave you today, it's important to think about overwhelmed. Overwhelmed can be the slow cooker, devastating performance killer if it's not handled with higher awareness before it turns into either burnout, or mental stiffness. So as you have seen, our natural instinct is to want to do more when we feel overwhelmed, thinking that by maybe waking up earlier every day or sleeping later, right? By thinking that we have more time, we think that we can resolve constant overwhelmed. And when in fact, it is a sign that we need to evolve our processors, right? And use it as a fuel and a fertilizer to upgrade ourselves. Because even the most chronic overwhelmed is in fact a gift for our great evolution. So the analogy of becoming a better and faster, more reliable processor when we are overwhelmed demonstrate the necessity of understanding the spiritual dimension of overwhelmed that I cannot stress enough. Because when we are overwhelmed, we are trying to simply answer this question: what to do and when to do it. Quite simply. And that is all about understanding the true nature of cosmic order and the law of cycle and rhythm. Because what to do and when to do it is embedded in the cycle and in the rhythm itself. Because this is why that in the fall or autumn, for example, right, a farmer knows that it's time to reap what he planted in winter, right? So this is really, that's why I'm here as an applied spirit coach to show you these different angles that have been around since ancient Egypt, so that you can leverage your spirit to optimize your performance. So the secret in defeating overwhelmed is to understand the anatomy of overwhelmed, so you can liberate yourself, so that it doesn't become constant overwhelmed and it doesn't become chronic. Because every chronic overwhelm should be used as a lever for your next evolution. Because when you understand that, you adhere to my favorite quote I always say: failure is a necessary prerequisite for human excellence. Till next time, live your truth. Coach Scholl out.